Hello, everyone. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on where you are and listening in. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the second of our conversations on global development politics. This is being organized by us at the Global Development Politics Specialist Group of the UK Political Studies Association. And it's really, we hope to develop this into a portal to discuss the latest on the politics of global development. There's been a lot written recently about the politics of development, about development vis-a-vis international development, global development, planetary development. So you can take your pick in terms of what you like, but hopefully the conversations here will give you some sense of what sorts of discussions are going on in the academic world of development politics. This is the second of our series where we're hoping to chat with authors of books on the politics of global development. So I'm delighted to welcome Ilyas Alami and Adam Dixon to chat about their latest work on the specters of state capitalism. Or is it the spectre of state capitalism? I'm sorry. We're so used to plurals these days. The spectre of state capitalism. So I'll let them introduce themselves and their work in a bit. But just to let everyone know, we're not necessarily sort of into having a long drawn out question and answer session. So if you did want to get in touch with the authors, look them up. They're very popular. Look them up and get in touch with. Right. So welcome, Ilyas. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So what I normally do with this is to start by asking you to tell us a bit about yourselves. How did you make or why did you make the journey into academia? And what happened? What's the backstory before we delve into the book? So I don't know who wants to go. I keep saying Ilyas Adam simply because of the way the authors' names appear in the book, but obviously either of you are free to.
I say we go with the position of the surname in the alphabet. So off you go, Ilias.
That's me. Okay. Yes. Well, I'm teaching here at Cambridge, mostly courses in political economy and development. But I consider myself a political economist. But I have a broad range of interests in global capitalism, global development, and most of my writing over the past few years has been on the state, on money and finance, and increasingly on questions of green industrial policies and racial capitalism. So that's who I am. Now, how I got here, and in terms of my career in academia, well, it was a bit of a long, drawn out journey, really. So I should say that I was born and grew up in France. And therefore, after high school, I went to something called classe préparatoire, where I studied really hard for 2 years, maths mostly and social sciences. After that, I got into a business school in France. I studied business and management for 3 years, got a master's degree in international management and business. Absolutely hated it. So decided to do something else, moved to the UK, did a master's in development studies, loved it, especially questions of political economy. And yeah, decided to continue to study for a PhD and then try a career in academia. So that's my
Excellent.
journey.
Yeah, quite, as you say, long drawn out, but interesting. I'm sure at least you know what you don't want.
Exactly. Yes, that's also important.
Adam.
Right. Thanks, Indrajit. So, like Ilias, I would say my journey has been quite divergent and different. And like Ilias, I didn't always know what I wanted to be when I grow up. I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. Still figuring that out. So currently, I hold the Adam Smith Chair at Panmure House, which is the last home of Adam Smith, which is owned by Heriot Watt University here in Edinburgh. a position that I've been in for just over a year and a half. Prior to that, I was at Maastricht University, and that's where I came to know Ilias, who so kindly came to work with me on a European Research Council project on which this book is one of the outcomes. And previous to that, I was at the University of Bristol at the School of Geographical Sciences. Prior to that, I was doing a DPhil at Oxford, which was in economic geography. And as you can see, my trip didn't go just through one specific discipline. Prior to that, I did a master's degree at Sciences Po in Paris, which I chose to go there because why not? I wanted to do an ethnography on the French elite. That's kind of half of what it was. The other half was studying a range of topics from finance and accounting to development, economics, history, etc. And then before that, I did an undergraduate degree in international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So my background, I would say, like Ilias, is very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, which I think. If you asked me, am I glad I took that path? Now I would say yes, but taking that path, there's always that risk where you think, oh, I should be very disciplined focused. I should be serving a particular discipline, because often that's how you make it in the academic world. Though I seem to have made it, so I think it's okay. And I'm saying this just to encourage people to take risks and to be different if you like, and study multiple perspectives, because I think that's really where you can add value in social science. And increasingly we need more of that. And just to make a final point, I mean, the position I have now where I'm sitting much of the time in Adam Smith's home, which was a center of debate and dialogue during the Scottish Enlightenment. When you look at the luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment, they were all very interdisciplinary, and they were all polymaths, and they would talk about science and literature and art and moral philosophy and what we understand as economy. And I think we need more of that.
Thanks so much to both of you. I think you're so right, Adam, to sort of remind us of the multiple disciplines or multidisciplinarity that's been at the heart of a lot of the questions around society and on society, for centuries. And I think while I'm sure disciplines have their values, and I don't think any of us want to close down any disciplines, but it certainly does make sense to draw on disciplines as freely as one, as is helpful to the questions you ask and to your research interests. And I do hope that people listening in would take both your messages, accordingly. Thank you. Thank you so much. So now if I could just sort of get us to talk about the book. How did the Spectre of State Capitalism come about? It is an open access book. I should have said that earlier. So people should, hopefully you've had loads and loads of downloads already, but if not, you probably will. Although I don't quite know how you define loads and loads of downloads, because you've got so many other publications. But anyway, tell us about the book. Tell us how, and you mentioned a bit, this emerged from your ERC project, but yeah, how did the book come into being? What was your motivation for writing it? And I guess what people would want to know is how you decided to collaborate. And you indicated a bit already, but yeah, tell us more.
Shall I, Ilias, go into that? So, I mean, yeah, so as I mentioned, I was fortunate to have an ERC grant to study sovereign wealth funds, which began in 2018. I had already studied sovereign wealth funds, large state-owned investment funds for several years before that. And in the context of some of that work, you would find people throwing out the phrase state capitalism, or because sovereign funds in effect are a form of state capital. They are state-owned investment companies. And they're very different in their mandates and such. And I had used state capitalism in a fairly lazy fashion at some point. And then when the project started, Ilias was on the job market, and I was fortunate enough to have him come. And one reason why I was glad to have Ilias was he wasn't necessarily an expert on sovereign wealth funds, which was fine. I wasn't looking for that, but he had broad experience under looking at state theory, the role of state in finance. I mean, he can say a bit more about his PhD project, but he was the right type of person to, I would say, help me and the project develop a bit more theoretically robust answer to how we understand state capital. Because I didn't want the project just to be about sovereign wealth funds. And one of the first meetings we had with Ilias, when again, I'm not usually the type to have like, this is what we're going to do from one year to the next. It's more like, oh, we should do that and let's just see where it goes. And one of the kind of questions, that was always sort of running in my head was, oh, we need to do some work on state capitalism. There needs to be some kind of, because it just seemed like I also myself wanted to have a better understanding of it, but I thought that the discipline or like the field, these multiple people using it, needed to have a better understanding of that. And then I said to Ilyas, let's just kind of like let's do a literature review. And that's really all it started out was a literature review. And that paper came out in Competition and Change in 2019. And from that, it just sort of spawned a bunch of stuff because as Ilyas and I, had ideas and Ilyas would be like, let's do that. And I'm like, okay, let's do that. It's great. And we just kind of go along. And then it just spawned into several papers, and then from there it was clear. Well, let's put a book together and let's kind of drive debate forward. So that's really how the project kind of developed. I mean, Elise, do you have any other thing to add?
Not much to add, though. I think this was a great overview of the whole thing. Your project was the first big project for me after the PhD, and during which I had started to look a little bit in those debates, because my PhD was on international finance and emerging markets, and especially the role of the state in mediating the relationship between, global finance and national economies in the global south. So as part of that, I had read some work which was on sovereign wealth funds, on state enterprises, on development banks, because in the sort of mid 2010s, there was a bit of literature in strategic management, international business, economic law, international relations, which was about trying to understand this phenomenon. So I was a little bit familiar with those debates, but I hadn't really engaged with them. And we only started doing that with your project, Alan.
Thanks. I guess people would like to know how you sort of decided who the first author was and who the second author was, but you can touch on that whenever you feel like it in the course of the conversation, because obviously that comes up a great deal in collaborative work. And I think we'll have, I want to ask you a bit more about collaboration down the line, but let's, in terms of the book itself and its themes, and you mentioned this, Adam, in your introduction. There's, of course, a lot of interest in different variations within capitalism. And, lots of us throw the term state capitalism around. So if I could ask you what you both mean by state capitalism when you refer to it, and how do you situate it in broader discussions around state-led capitalism, statist capitalism? I've even heard the term Stalinist capitalism. So yeah, just tell us a bit about how you situate your understanding. How do you understand state capitalism, and how do you situate it within broader discussions on variations within capitalism? I say variations within capitalism rather than the varieties of capitalism literature, because of course there's a huge literature, as you mentioned, beyond the VOC literature. So yeah, tell us.
At least you want to go? I mean, maybe it's just I think I'll let Ilias answer this, but perhaps it's rephrasing the question is what is the role of the state in capitalism? What does it mean to be state-led? A key question that we had posed in the original paper that we wrote was, what do people mean by, often they'll say a strong state. And you think, well, okay, what does a strong state mean in capitalism, right? I mean, if you look at advanced capitalist economies, you can't say that, for example, the United States federal government is not a strong state, right? So it's you think, okay, well, even in the most liberal, if you like, capitalist economies, often their success, has a lot to do with a strong state, depending on what we mean by strong, right? But often the literature would be like a strong state, and that idea would be kind of China's a strong state, or some kind of state, state-led developmentalist model is a strong state. But often, what is strong, it becomes quite arbitrary. So I think that is, perhaps for your listeners, a big question for us that we posed, which then forces us to think about what do we mean by state capitalism as a variant, if you like, of these debates around what state-led economies look like.
Yeah, just to add to that. So I think, it's really important to clarify at the outset that the state is really important in capitalism, in any form of capitalism that we know, in any form of really existing capitalism since the birth of this mode of production, the state has been incredibly important. So, this is really important to keep in mind as we discuss those notions of state-led capitalism, state capitalism, etc. And this is also partly why we were a bit dissatisfied with the recent literature on state capitalism as we started to engage with this field, which is that this literature tended to use the term in a way that wasn't grounded in this understanding of the state, its historical role in capitalism, and so on. And so, it was a lot of the literature was basically saying things like, oh, here's a national political economy where the state visibly does a lot of things, and therefore we should call this state capitalism. Or here's a few state enterprises which appear to be very active internationally, and therefore we should call this state capitalism. Or here's a sovereign wealth fund, therefore that's a case of state capitalism. And we thought that this was not a particularly interesting or helpful way to use the term. So our first contribution to those debates was actually to try and unpack the uses of the term and deconstruct how this category was used as a means to critically emphasize that actually the state is very important everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that this literature was not pointing at interesting empirical facts, but then that would require sort of reconstructing a concept of state capitalism that was better anchored in the long-standing historical role of the state in capitalism. So that was our first contribution to this debate. And I should add too that the notion itself of state capitalism is actually really interesting in itself. It's the genealogy of the term is very interesting. It has a very long history. It started to be being used by Marxists in the late 19th century, including people like Lenin and others. It was then used in the interwar period by other scholars and activists to refer to, fascist regimes, the war economy, and so on. It was then used to refer to the Soviet Union, to models of state-led developmentalism in the global South, in the post-war environment, etc., etc. So you have this very long and rich history where the term has been used to refer to all sorts of different configurations. And so it's important also to sort of acknowledge those histories and unpack a bit how the concept has been used and what we can make of it at the current moment. And we can come back to this in a few minutes. But I guess the whole point of the category, we argue, is that it still helps us to understand what the state is currently doing in the present historical juncture. And we do, or our hope in the book is to offer a way to conceptualize the term that helps us do that.
Thanks. I think that is very helpful to know how you're sort of critically engaging, if you will, with the existing ways in which the ideas and the words have been thrown around. And obviously, lots of people have used it, and I think it helps to sort of go back to the question that you posed at the beginning. What is the role of the state in capitalism? Is, I guess, how you're sort of pitching it, if you will. But tell us more about the themes of the book. And you touched on this a bit, Ilyas, in your sort of response. But yeah, I think we'd like to know a little more about the themes that you cover in the book.
Should I say a few things about this, Adam? Yes. Okay. Yes, great question. So the book really is about why does the state appear to be returning at the current historical moment? And I'm saying here appearing because, of course, the state has never left. The state, as we covered already, has always been there in capitalism, playing a very important role, very extensive role, doing all sorts of things. But it certainly does appear that the state, and in fact, multiple states in the global economy, have been more active and more visibly active as of late, including through things like sovereign wealth funds, state enterprises, development and policy banks, state-backed venture capital funds, central banks. So, a lot of state ownership. State ownership is very important in the global economy. That's kind of an interesting thing in itself that the book aims to explain. And secondly, states have been also much more active in terms of directly intervening in capital accumulation, if you will. So things like trade and investment restrictions, state-led coordinated investment in infrastructure, techno-industrial policies, development plans. So the book really is an attempt to understand why states have been engaged in those two modalities of intervention: state ownership on the one hand, and those direct forms of intervention in the economy on the other hand. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that's a story of crises. There's this 2008 global financial crisis. There is COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the return of inflation. All of this, it has become quite clear to pretty much everyone, has pushed states to intervene more. Now, we say, yes, absolutely. That's certainly part of the story. But the argument we make in the book is that, in fact, those crises only acted as catalysts or as moments of acceleration in this repurposed, expanded role of the state. And in order to understand why that is the case, we need to look at the historical and geographical development of the global economy over the past 20 years. So it's not just a story of crisis, it's about deep-seated world historical transformations in the world economy over the past 20 years, and how states have mediated these transformations. In other words, how states have been caught up in those transformations, how they have enabled them, sometimes resisted them, and sometimes accelerated them. So that's the sort of key argument that we make in the book. And really what we do is look at a range of geographies in the world economy, how different countries, different states have participated in this process. And we use multiple examples across a range of sectors. We look at things like semiconductors, EV batteries, raw materials extraction and experts, finance, real estate, lots of different sectors. Perhaps I'll leave it at that for now.
So readers wanting to sort of learn a bit about the political economy of semiconductors might also benefit from some of the chapters. Is that a fair question to ask, or is that not something you'd like to say yes to totally?
Yes, totally. I would say so the book, the way it's constructed is not the conventional, here's a couple of theory chapters and then here's some case studies on particular countries or a particular industry. Yeah. We wanted explicitly to avoid that model, partly because, I don't know, I kind of find that model of writing to be a bit tedious at times, where it's usually enough. I mean, that's not to say I don't like books that are really deep dive case studies on particular countries or comparisons of countries, comparisons of a sector, for example. But what we wanted to do was tell a bigger story that could draw on, different things that were happening in the world. That's hard to do. Publishers are reluctant to do that, unfortunately. That's what we found in this process. Though I think they're incredibly wrong about that, and the interest in our work, I think, attests to that, but I won't go further into my irritation with academic publishing at the moment. But I think one thing just to add to Elias's, great kind of summary of the book is that what we ultimately wanted to do was just to facilitate and invite a conversation about the state in the 21st century that, is willing to be a bit bold in terms of not just sort of falling into specific categories to say this is state-led or that's not state-led, to really put a mirror on to capitalism generally, right? So it was, a lot of the initial use of state capitalism as a concept, or not the initial, but the kind of more recent stuff, is usually to explain or describe countries like China or emerging market economies. And often it, I think, ignores the significant role of the state that we're seeing in the advanced capitalist economies. I mean, just was it yesterday, the day before, the UK government announced GB Energy is going to be set up in Aberdeen, and that's it's kind of a renationalization of power generation in the UK, right? I mean, to say that we're not in a state capitalist moment in places like the UK, the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the amount of money that's going in to support infrastructure and the green transition, we can't just ignore it and say, oh, it's just, we've moved on from neoliberalism and now we're in a state. We wanted to have a broader based conversation. And that's why I think the book allows people from different disciplines to, take different aspects of the book in terms of helping them sort of think about different aspects of their work, whether it is the green transition and the role of the state, whether it is about the kind of, messiness in terms of trying to compare different types of economies from, compare, the global South with the global North, for example.
Thank you.
Just to add a quick word on that. Yes, sorry. So perhaps just to clarify a bit what I said earlier and to answer directly your question on the political economy of semiconductors and so on. So the book is not about that quite directly. It's more about, we're not experts in the political economy of semiconductors or the political economy of the EV sector, etc. The book is about specifically how states intervene in those sectors and why they do it this way. So this is really about why state ownership is mobilized at the current historical juncture and why does it take this form. We try and answer questions like why the US, for instance, has announced a couple of weeks ago that a team in the Biden administration is considering launching a new sovereign wealth fund. Mm-hmm. Or why the UK now is the UK as well.
And Donald Trump said he wanted a US sovereign wealth fund, right? So it's bipartisan. That's the thing. It's bipartisan.
Yeah. And so we try and explain that by looking at, as I said earlier, some world historical transformations in global capitalism. And then just to sketch the argument to your listeners, we emphasize 4 transformations in particular. One is the geographical reconfiguration of the global economy over the past 20 years, which has required massive state intervention to facilitate a new pattern of global economic development on a world scale. We also, and as a result of that, there's been also a growing multipolarity of power and a reshuffling of geoeconomic force fields in the global economy. This is also incredibly important to understand why states are intervening more. There's also been a deepening of so-called secular stagnation, as economists call it, which is the idea that the world economy has entered a sort of period of relative stagnation, characterized by low investment rates, low labor productivity growth rates, low economic growth rates in general. And so these two is pushing states to intervene more, partly because it also accelerates or intensifies competition between firms, as well as between states. And so as a result of those 4 sort of deep-seated economic transformations, we argue in the book, states have been forced to reinvent and repurpose their roles as industrial policy actors, as investors, as shareholders, as direct owners of firms and assets, etc., etc. So yes, again, this is about locating those state transformations and rooting them in the world historical development of global capitalism. And this is something that is not specific to national economies or their specific models. This is something that cuts across all of those models, including models which have very different ideological orientations or political systems. They can be democracies, or at least theoretical democracies, or they can be more authoritarian, etc., etc. We've been observing this phenomenon pretty much everywhere, of course, in very uneven ways, but pretty much everywhere. And this is what the book tries to explain.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think it also helps to know what the book is about and distinguish it from what it's not really focusing on, but might give you glimpses. So thank you so much for clarifying that. And I think it also helps to sort of see how you're locating it, as you put it, in this series of world historical transformations, if you will. But also I'd like to ask you a bit about this. You're in chapter 4, you specifically root state capitalism in what you call uneven development. And of course, that is not what you call uneven development, but what is generally called uneven development. And that's, of course, a nice segue into, old and new questions in development studies. And whether it's international development or global development or planetary development, the question of unevenness is something that has stuck on. So tell us more. What does that mean in for your argument and in your context to root state capitalism in uneven development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can start saying a couple of things, and then Adam, if you'd like, you can add to what I said. But I guess I'll start by saying that as part of our initial work of engagement with the literature, which we mentioned earlier, so the literature in strategic management, international business, the varieties of capitalism literature as well, there was an implicit theory of uneven development in this literature, which is that the world economy was characterized by a range of national varieties of capitalism. And in particular, you had maybe two broad categories. Let's say three. You had liberal market economies in the Anglo-Saxon countries, let's say the US and the UK mostly. You had coordinated market economies in advanced Western capitalist economies and maybe Japan. And then you also had increasingly powerful state-led economies in emerging markets. So that their theory of uneven development is that you have those three broad varieties of capitalism, all of which feature different roles for the state. Now, what we're trying to say is that this is sort of true in a way. I mean, there's some empirical validity to this description, but it's also a very limited understanding of the role of the state in the global economy. And it's missing a lot of the trends that cut across those different varieties, those different models. So as I said earlier in my previous response to one of your questions, what we've been witnessing is deep structural trends in the world economy that, again, cut across all of those models. Those have an immense impact on how states intervene in the economy. So this has to be theorized. Of course, this happens in very uneven ways across the world economy, depending on where states are located in the international division of labor. What kind of goods do they produce, how they are integrated into global value chains or global production networks, where do they fit into international financial and monetary relations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that, in fact, the story of uneven development is very important to understand those transformations. A key argument in the book is that the geographical transformation of the world economy over the past 20 years is something world historical. So, if you think about the history of capitalism, arguably since the long 16th century, which is when capitalism emerged, the center of gravity of global capitalism has been the North Atlantic. But what we've seen over the past couple decades is that there's been a shift of the center of gravity towards the Pacific Rim, with a lot of manufacturing activities being located in East Asia, exporters of primary commodities, in Latin America, Africa, and other parts of Asia have been, their role as exporters of primary commodities has been boosted by the huge demand for primary resources on the part of East Asia. And so, yes, you have this enormous recalibration in geographical terms of the global economy, which, sort of set up a new pattern of global economic development, new flows of investment, new global imbalances in terms of trade, investment, and so on. And this has required massive state intervention, both to sort of deal with the crisis associated with all that, but also to literally produce space or territory as a means to facilitate this new circulation of money, capital, commodities, people, etc. So, a lot of connective infrastructure had to be built: airport, railways, roads, ports, etc., etc. A lot of energy networks, logistical networks to move commodities around. All of that has required that states, reinvent their roles, as we argue in the book, as owners of capital, but also as direct investors. So that's the sort of theory of uneven development that we try to offer as a means to anchor our understanding of transformations in the state role.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful to sort of get a sense. I mean, one could almost say, there's the North Atlantic, and then there's the continental Europe, and there's the Pacific Rim, as you put it, or others might even, sort of venture into calling it the Indo-Pacific, but we leave that for another conversation. Sorry, Adam, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think maybe one additional point too is that, I'm just picturing some people wondering, well, but isn't China state capitalist and France is more state capitalist than Germany? And to a certain degree, and we talk about this in the book and previous papers, is that, attempts to quantify what state capitalism is through state intervention and the like, it allows for some, let's say, appreciation of the weight of the state in the economy, but often it's still dependent on a particular arbitrary delineation of, okay, well, 30% ownership dictates that it's state capitalist. And it prevents us from looking at what states actually do and the various forms through which the state, so it's not just simply to say that, oh, the economy has this many number of state-owned enterprises as a portion of GDP. Because again, while half of our model relies on, let's say, the state capital hybrids, right? So it is looking at things like state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, national development banks, so on and so forth, but it's also these other muscular forms of statism, which do not necessarily require state ownership or state control. And so I think that's what really separates us out. But so if you said to me, is the United States state capitalist economy compared with China, you'd say, well, of course, China is much more, if you want to be kind of crude about it, state capitalist than, say, the United States. But I think that limits our gaze on the degree to which the U.S. federal government and state governments and municipal governments are kind of active in driving, U.S. economic growth, for example, or U.S. economic development. And that's what we really want to do, is to not just simply lean on and say, yes, well, of course, France is statist. They always have been. And it's like, it's part of their culture. And yes, that's true. You can see that when you compare it to sort of say the Germany from a varieties of capitalism perspective. But then it really then kind of limits our gaze to what we're seeing conceptually. And why that's important that we push this is because, again, as Ilias mentioned, look what's happened in the last 20 years. Right? So we have an increase in state capital hybrids, not simply in the countries that we would expect those to exist. It's happening in the UK with this new national wealth fund, which isn't really a sovereign wealth fund, but that's another topic. But again, we see this, growth in state capital hybrids, and we see the growth in more muscular forms of statism, right? And this is something that, we can't just say, oh, well, that's capitalism as normal, and there's always a capitalist state. That just for us doesn't seem to be very kind of satisfactory. And one final point I'll make, again, going back to the focus on uneven and combined development, is we wanted to put this in a global perspective. So we're talking about global capitalism. Our kind of frustration with varieties of capitalism approach, and this for me goes way back to when I was doing a PhD and other works I've done, is it always felt too disjointed and didn't appreciate the kind of interdependencies and the kind of strong relations that you see that come together to make capitalist market economies function, right? It always is sort of like, if we want to get away from the sort of state market binary, then we need to get away from this binary that thinks of national economies as these kind of fixed, hermetically sealed economies that run in particular ways. That's not to say that we can't learn a lot from comparative political economy in that kind of traditional sense, But what we want to do in the book, and I think this kind of comes from our sort of place in the sort of geographical political economy space, is that we are, want to break down and understand these different scales and different geographies that come together. And that's where part of the uneven and divine combined development comes in, to helping us construct that story, construct that picture of a global capitalism that is in flux, and how states within this global capitalism that's in serious flux and change are reacting to these broader changes in a world historical moment that we're in.
Thanks. I think it's good to get a sense of, again, what you're not doing, and there's no construction of state capitalist indices, I guess, in this. What you're more interested in is as you put it, the ways in which states, sort of the roles of states and the different kinds of roles and actions that states take in different in different contexts. And I suspect, this sort of analysis could also lend itself. And you talked about nation states not being sealed off from one another, but also subnational comparisons could also be interesting, I guess, because many large heterogeneous federal states have, lots of economic powers devolved downwards. And I'm sure that those are sort of things that others are thinking of, or you might also be thinking of. But it just struck me that there's a lot of different ways in which your work lends itself to interpretation and analysis, rather than constructing an index of X is more state capitalist than Y and close it with that. And I think that probably is what makes it so interesting. But I want to sort of touch on a point that came up earlier, and maybe you can sort of take us through in I think it's chapter 5, where speaking to the role of the state in that sense. You talk about the expropriation of the capitalist by state capitalism, and of course the term expropriation is very evocative, and some would even say provocative, but I'd like to sort of hear from you. What does that mean to talk about expropriation of the capitalist by state capitalism, and how is it different from the sorts of expropriations that have been associated with the USSR and or China? I won't take names of individuals there, but you all know what I mean. Yeah, how is it different or similar for that matter? How does it resonate with those kinds of expropriations we've associated with specific contexts and countries?
So just to kind of put that, I'll let Ilyas answer the specific expropriation use of that term, but the genesis of that chapter and the paper on which we developed that argument was when we were putting, like I said earlier, we started out with just a literature review, and then you start thinking, okay, what are the different things we can do? And one of the aims was to look at state-owned entities of various forms as a kind of from a perspective of a theory of the firm. What does the firm do and how they constituted? And there's some work on, thinking about ownership and control and what does that mean? And so we wanted to do that in the perspective of how do we make sense of state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds as these state entities, and why we wanted to do that is, and this is an interesting, I think, point to add about the book generally in the argument, is that I think some assume that state capitalism means a return to some form of economic planning that is not market conforming, that's not neoliberal, if we want to use that term, that is heavily politicized, and by politicized I mean serving the political masters for particular kind of non-market, non-competitive goals. But actually what you see, and I think this is what is interesting and what it makes is important to emphasize, is that many of the state-owned enterprises that we see, yes, a lot of state-owned enterprises are still only active in the national economy. Think of public utilities or national rail systems and the like, and they're natural monopolies of the like. But you have a number, and yes, China is heavily kind of weighted in those statistics globally, but you have a lot of firms that are globally active The biggest irony for UK Rail is that, all the trains are run by, European state-owned enterprises, right? It's Deutsche Bahn or SNCF, I think, or NS from the Netherlands. It's all these that's the big irony. Privatize it and let some other state-owned company run them. But again, what you see is that these companies are trying to operate as any other multinational company would. Many of them are listed or partially privatized, if you like, and listed on stock exchanges. They are following OECD codes of corporate governance. They are managed, if you like, by professional managers, many of whom have experience working in the private sector. And this goes also for, state-owned enterprises and even national development banks, right? When I interact with people that work at development finance corporations or the like, you always find, some of them have a long career in multilateral financial institutions, but some, they've worked on Wall Street, or they worked in the City of London. Now they're working in a development bank, right? So you see this. It's not to say that, state capitalism is more sort of planning driven, if you like. These are actually driven in a way that is more market conforming, if you like, and they're not this. And so again, that's the genesis of that particular chapter, to sort of unpack a bit of a theory of the firm that doesn't just leave an understanding of the firm as in the context of a state-owned enterprise as something that's driven by politics. Now, this doesn't answer the expropriation by capitalist answer, but Ilias, if you want to go into that.
Yes, happy to. So it's a great question, and I think this chapter in the book is important because it does raise the question of property relations. And this line, which is also the title of the chapter, which is, the expropriation of capitalists by state capitalists, is actually us riffing on the line of Marx in Capital Volume 1, which is where he talks about the financial system or the modern credit system facilitating a form of centralization of capital, so firms buying each other out. And this, he refers to that change of ownership, amongst capitalists, often to the benefit of the larger ones, facilitating this, what we call concentration of capital in contemporary economic terms, but actually is better described as a process of centralization of more and more capital into fewer and fewer hands. So the reason we're riffing on this line is that, as Adam said, now the more economically performant state enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, and so on, those really operate like transnational corporations. They're often more or equally efficient than multinational corporations. They have global operations, operate in multiple countries and so on. So really, this is kind of a new beast in terms of this phenomenon. We there's a long history, of course, of state enterprises, but most of the time we would have in mind, the classical, for instance, public utility operating within the national economy. But yeah, again, the state ownership looks quite different at the current moment than it used to in the past. So the chapter tries and grapple with that fact. It tries and explain why state ownership now is incredibly corporatized or marketized and operates like comparable private sector entities. And it also look at how and why those state-owned corporate entities have grown so much. And this, we argue, in order to understand that, again, we need to look at the global economy and the process of centralization of capital that has happened across multiple sectors. So again, this refers simply to the fact that you have firms buying each other out, and therefore you end up with fewer firms which look bigger than the smaller ones. Of course, this process is related to the four world historical transformations that I talked about earlier: the geographical rebalancing of the global economy, secular stagnation, etc., etc. The key argument of the paper, of this chapter and the broader book, is that states have been incredibly active in facilitating this centralization of capital, including as owners of corporate entities. So this is what we end up referring to as the expropriation of capitalists by state capitalists, because we document in the chapter cases across a wide range of sectors of state enterprises, not only buying each other out, but also buying out or taking participation into private firms, privately owned firms, or firms which are not owned by states. And therefore, you have, again, simply, capital changing hands, but increasingly being concentrated into state-owned hands, or the hands of states, rather, to put it in simpler terms. So that's the sort of the reason why we use this line, the expropriation of capitalists by state capitalists. Now, of course, this is quite an interesting question, because that means that we're entering a period, dare I say it, of capitalism where more and more capital and assets are owned or controlled by states. Now, clearly, that's an interesting fact, right? Because capitalism is predicated upon private property and, private and independent agents conducting productive activities and so on. But this, of course, is always socialized in different ways under capitalism. But in this case, notably because of the role of the financial system, a lot of this socialization ends up in the situation where states owned more and more of capitals and assets. So I'll leave it there for now, but I hope this encourages your listeners to have a look at this chapter, which I think is an interesting one.
Amazing. It really clarified some of the I guess it was intriguing, and it really clarifies the usual assumption that is often made with, well, the contemporary, I don't want to use the world historical moment, because I'm not quite sure exactly what I might mean by that, but we associate what's called neoliberalism with privatization. And of course, what you're referring to is quite the opposite process, maybe not statization, but something along those lines, where it's state entities that are expropriating all kinds of capital, whether it's state or private sector. Thank you. That's really, really helpful.
Can I just add one point to that? I mean, this is where, again, there's an element of quite a bit of geopolitics at play, in that with this, as Elias mentioned, you have state companies or state funds buying private companies. This is where you see the increase in scrutiny with investment screening regulations, because what you'll find, and China is really the big player here, is that you'll have a private company buy a UK company, and then you look at the private company and you realize, oh, the ultimate owner of that is, a Chinese state-owned bank or something like that. And that's where the politics comes in, because it is still the case in the liberal international order, where state capital is seen as problematic, or at least it raises the question of, can it be politicized? Again, what we say though is that's always an empirical question, right? So we're not sort of, we don't have this sort of knee-jerk reaction that all state ownership is necessarily at the expense of market efficiency. And I am always quick to tell market liberals that just relax. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. But that's where I think, again, for your listeners, there's a lot of politics in there. So it's not just an economic kind of story. There's certainly those that are studying political, geopolitics will find a lot in the book.
I mean, that's a great way to, for me to lead into my next question, really, which is referring to your penultimate chapter in the book, where you refer to the anxieties and adjustments that these developments bring about. And of course, that chapter is titled, it's around anxieties and adjustment in global development. And that's where I guess it becomes even more interesting to listeners of global development and followers of global development. You already mentioned the China word, I guess, which, brings its fair share of anxieties and hopes, I dare say, among lots of people. But also, I think that the point about adjustments are well taken. So tell us more. What are the and you referred to some of this already. The moment you talk about China, there's anxiety involved. But I'd like to hear a bit more from you what the anxieties and specifically the adjustments are that we can look forward to in reading this chapter.
So there's what's interesting, and we document this, is you look at the big multilaterals, World Bank, even IMF, there is a specific kind of almost explicit embrace of sovereign wealth funds are okay, state-owned enterprises are okay, and increasingly you see industrial policy is okay, right? So what you think of as statism or state capitalism is okay at, the entities that are supposed to be the purveyors of the Washington consensus, right? So that's a big shift in global development. The anxiety of it, though, is that this is okay, assuming, though, that they follow these particular rules, that they are, market conforming, that they are, there's a clear governance structure that limits political interference, that it's not going to distort markets. It's still within that context, right? So I think that's the anxiety, is that on the one hand, and I think it's partly, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Elias, but I would say partly the embrace of it is because they just had to, right? The Washington, based organizations just kind of had to. You can't, like, it was the train had already left the station, and, governments across the Middle East, emerging markets, in as much as they tried to privatize, a lot of them haven't been successful, so it's like, well, we got to embrace it somehow, right? That this is a thing, right? So one point I'll make is that we assume that, privatization is almost an easy thing, but actually there's a lot of investors that aren't that keen to sort of invest in, some Kazakh state-owned enterprises that has a very Soviet kind of way of doing it. Seriously, I mean, this is the thing is, there's governments in the global South that probably would like to privatize, but there's still investors that are like, sorry, I'm not really interested in it. And so the state they still have to be run as going concerns as kind of state capital. And so I think those little things that aren't always appreciated means that, well, they kind of had to accept it. And if this is the way of the world, then how do we kind of still change it or ensure that it's conforming to our particular kind of worldview? Is that more or less, did I get that right, Elias? I think.
Yes, very much so. I think it's just to add a couple more points to this. What we document in the book is that there's been many states in the global economy experimenting with all sorts of means of intervening in the economy. State ownership, trade investment restrictions, various forms of development strategies, etc., etc. Now, quite a bit of that, though of course not everything, but quite a bit of that flies in the face a little bit of the prescriptions of international development institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. And all of it doesn't, but quite some of it does. Which means that international financial institutions at some point were sort of forced to acknowledge the existence of those practices and have embraced the fact that those were here to stay. Governments across the world economy will continue experimenting with those. And therefore, maybe those international financial institutions will need to adapt their policy prescriptions in order to stay relevant in this context. And that means updating how they theorize and what role they prescribe for state ownership. They can't say anymore that state ownership is something destined to disappear with the movement of modernization and privatization and so on, because obviously it's not. It's simply not disappearing. Privatization was a very real and, very significant movement, but it was always incomplete, full of contradictions, was prone to reversals, etc., etc. And again, states are just remobilizing state ownership in very explicit ways. So those international financial institutions are simply forced to adapt to this context. Of course, on top of that, there's a huge geopolitical element, which is the rise of China, with its own model, so to speak, or at least with its own way of doing things, which, for better or worse, acts as a source of inspiration for many people around the world. Many governments have sort of looked at what China and other East Asian economies have been doing and have tried to find inspiration from that. So, to cut the story short, international development institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, etc., if they want to stay relevant in this new state capitalist world, if you want to call it like that, they had to sort of adapt their policy prescriptions. They had to produce new ideology, if you will. And this is fundamentally about the role of the state in development, its adequate place and role and ways of intervening in it. And this is again simply to adapt to this new world. If they want to stay relevant, if they want to retain sources of expertise and authority in this world economy, which has always been the source of their power, is that they have this claim to knowledge and expertise. So they simply need to adapt. And this is, since we wrote the book, I did a bit more work on that with Jack Taggart, who's at Queen's University Belfast, and we looked into how the prescriptions of the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO even, how those have evolved over the past 20 years. And it's very clear that there's a very noticeable evolution in how those institutions talk about state ownership and what they prescribe to governments across the world. They even set up new task forces to write reports on state ownership. They are very keen in terms of understanding how contemporary state ownership operates. And of course, their objective there is that they want to govern the conduct of those state enterprises, right? They want to make sure that this new state capitalism remains market friendly or market conforming, that it doesn't distort markets too much, that it doesn't upend the price system too much, that it remains sort of managed by managers and boards of directors that come from the private sector, etc., etc. So it's an attempt from those international development finance institutions, which feel quite anxious, to come back to the title of the chapter, to remain relevant, but also to try and shape the unfolding development of this new state capitalism.
Thanks. That's helpful also to sort of think about the varieties of anxieties, if you will, as well as adjustments. But tell us, what further questions or issues do you think you've raised which you've not been able to sort of cover? Obviously, a book cannot do everything and should not probably aim to do everything. But building on the back of your response just now, what sorts of future agendas would you advise folks to explore? Obviously, that you weren't able to, or that have since arisen, based on your own work. What are the kinds of questions you think people who are interested in this should or would make sense going forward?
We did put together a tripartite special issue in the journal Environment and Planning A, Economy and Space, which was fantastic. We want to do a special issue, and then it becomes a 3-part special issue with, I think, 21 papers or even more on a range of different topics. And so I would encourage listeners to go and look at that and to see the types of, because it was everything from looking at techno-industrial policy and the competition between Chinese platform technology platforms versus sort of the US platform, and how this kind of sits in a state capitalist frame, to global logistics, to more sort of traditional development questions. So there's a range of different things that I think are possible for us. Because again, at the end of the day, it's less about, are people applying our particular sort of definition of state capitalism, and are we getting citations because of some sort of theory? That's great, sure. Please cite the book as much as you can, but that's not really the point. It was just an invitation to sort of put some important questions around about this sort of world historical moment where we see more state intervention, and I think that lends itself to all kinds of different things, right? Whether you're studying kind of comparing emerging markets, so to speak, and in development policy, there's probably something there for you. But there's likewise, I think you can look at, let's say defense spending now in the kind of rearmament of Europe, and the how this has all these elements of state industrial policy and the like in the context of the war, the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, right? So there's lots, I think, that could be taken from this. And then perhaps, Ilias, if you want to point out some of the the different aspects in the final chapter of the book, which talks about the green transition or state ownership of a more progressive form.
Yeah, I can say some words about this. So I think, well, first of all, we closed the book by sort of raising the point that when looking at the transformations which we think are the root cause of state capitalism, then those are only going to increase in significance, which means that state capitalism is probably here to stay. Um, which means that we probably should do more work on this. And we also speculate that the question of climate change and ecological breakdown is going to boost state capitalism even more, and is going to deepen some of the state capitalist trends that we've been witnessing over the past couple of decades. So the relationship between state capitalism and climate change is certainly something that we think would deserve further research. Obviously, states, including as owners of capital, are directly invested in all sorts of extractive industries and fossil-based industries. Adam and Milan Babic have been doing some work on that. But states are also using their newfound powers to try and accelerate the climate transition with those, various Green New Deals that we've been witnessing, or green techno-industrial policies. So you have an interesting contradiction here where state capitalism is sort of caught in this paradox, or between, this sort of the death of this old world in terms of energy patterns and so on, and the birth of a new one. And state capitalism is not only caught into this passively, but is directly implicated in the reproduction or the non-dying of the old world, and the sort of like protracted emergence of the new one. So there's some interesting things to do about this. I think there's also interesting work to do on state capitalism and the sort of, thinking about it from a conjunctural analysis perspective. So what kind of strategic political opportunities are being opened by the state capitalist movement for progressive forces to push forward their agendas or to articulate progressive policy proposals? What are the implications of state owning a lot more stuff and doing all sorts of new things in the economy? Can we try and shape how states do that? How they use those newfound powers? I think it's an interesting question. And and finally, the question of state capitalism and how it manifests at different scales, in particular the urban scale. So how cities and city governments, city regions, how those are key sites and actors of state capitalism, how they mediate some of the contradictions, how they are the sites of conflicts as well of state capitalism, I think is an interesting thing. Yeah.
Excellent. So lots of questions to sort of look at for colleagues who may be able to hear till the very end of this conversation, ranging from the planetary to the very local, if you will. But thank you. Thank you so much. We're well over the hour. Thank you so much for your patience. I just have one final question, which I think everyone will be interested to listen to. We're in a world of increasing competition, and, academics have to sort of increase their citations, publish a lot more, and no one really has the time for co-authored stuff. You don't. It's often considered a thankless job. I don't even know how it's refed or rewarded in the ref. But any tips for? But people like to work together. Obviously, that's why we're in academia. Yes, we might call ourselves ideational entrepreneurs or things like that. But at the end of the day, there is a collegiality we value, and it's great to see co-authored pieces. Edited stuff is great, and that's good, and that also is a sort of collegiality. But when you're co-authoring a monograph, it's quite a task, I'm sure. So, any tips for colleagues planning to write a co-authored monograph?
So, I think even thinking about our collaboration, on the one hand, Ilias was kind of working for me as a postdoc, so he didn't really have a choice, right? It was sort of, no, but I just say that in a kind of functional thing. But the way I approach collaboration, and I approach, when I had the project and the Ilias, and then the other postdoc, Milan Babic, and the PhD that came out of the project, Imogen Liu, is I said to all of them, listen, like, technically I'm the boss, right? I have to sort of sign off on timesheets, and I'm kind of responsible for that. But I said, listen, we are, I look at you as a kind of as a partner, a collaborator. It's really important for me that this work is seen as much, if not more, as yours than it is mine. And that's partly because I think it's important just to find like Ilias is brilliant. Sorry, Ilias, I'm going to say that. He's got all the kinds of ideas. And so for me, it's like, how can I benefit from that? And how can I kind of foster his professional and personal development as a scholar? Because I think that just it makes it a more fun, collaborative experience. It's not like this sort of like, transactional thing, like you're here to work from where it's more like you're an owner of this too. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, at least, but it kind of motivates him and the others to do that. And I think that's really important for scholars, even if they're sort of at the same level, is to sort of have that partnership model. And if you're a more senior position scholar, I think it's for me, I get gratification by seeing the people that have worked with me like go on and do amazing things, and that their career is important because it just it's why not? It's great. And I think I'm always troubled when I see, PIs that are kind of like these sort of prima donnas or, that are like it's all about them. And I just don't, I don't think that's a model that's useful. And I don't think, and again, I'm doing all right, so I can't complain. But I'm doing all right because I've collaborated with people like Ilias who are great, and they make me a better scholar at the end of the day, right? I mean, so like I said in the beginning, I had some ideas, and I'd always wanted to do something more theoretically robust around sovereign funds, around state capital, but I couldn't have done it alone. And Ilias comes along and he's got really great ideas. And same thing with the other people that were part of the project. They have great ideas. And that's then, I learn from it and I benefit. And, I think that's what I would say to people is like, we're not in competition with each other. It's like we're in competition with the man, if you like, the system, right? It's not, we just need to get out there and do it and persist, and it comes out okay.
Yeah, just to add a quick point to that, it's I think reflecting on from my own perspective and having been on the job market for some time recently. I mean, I have a permanent position finally, but I applied for lots and lots of jobs over the past 2 to 3 years and went to many job panel interviews and so on. And I think most of the time co-authoring, the fact that I have co-authored with a lot with Adam as well as with other people, I think this was valued. Only once I got someone on the panel, and I'm not going to say where or who, but it was like, oh yeah, you've got all of those publications with the Dixon, but obviously he was your PhD supervisor and he did all the work, right? He's just trying to help you out. I was like, well, so, but I think this was this was just the odd case. And again, in my experience, most of the time, it seemed that the fact that I have co-authored with Adam quite a bit and some other people, I hope I think it gave also the idea that I mean it's good to collaborate with people and it can be very valuable and rewarding as well. I think it's still important though to have some single authored pieces to complement. I mean, only speaking from the perspective of people who are on the job market and who are trying to get a first job in particular, because you also want to show that you're capable of doing that stuff by yourself. But otherwise, otherwise I think people have been appreciative of.
I would say, I mean, Ilias brings up a good point. I mean, it's so when that's thing is when Ilias applied, he had just finished the PhD at Manchester, but he had 3 or 4 papers already out, that were single authored, and which is important. And then when he came, he worked on, put that into a book as well. And so I think it is true that you still have to demonstrate that, oh, you can do it yourself. Unfortunately, people have this, but I think with any, like, Ilias and I have a lot of papers together, but to like say that I did all the work, absolutely not. I would say, quite the contrary. I mean, a lot of it's, it's definitely Ilias is there. And so I think, and for someone to ask Ilias that, I think that's a bit like, come on, it's more collaborative than
And folks will be interested to hear about the positioning of the authors. How do you decide, especially in this monograph, how do you sort of decide who the first author is? Was it just looking at the first letter of the last name, or?
I would say that makes it easier for us because he's put it alphabetical. but I think I would have put Ilias against. So for me, as I mentioned before, like I'm doing all right, and it doesn't hurt me to support people like Ilias. I mean, we didn't have to even think about it, but I would have never always thought of him as being first author.
Yeah.
Then that's only right, and I think that's when you see certain like big famous names, and I'm just thinking one book, I won't say what it is, and I'm like, I think the co-author did. I think the co-author actually wrote the book, and you just put
Yeah.
your name
Yeah.
up there because it's famous.
I think
I won't
that's
say who that
exactly
is,
what needs
but
to be conveyed. Yeah, exactly
yeah,
what needs to be conveyed,
no,
right?
I mean maybe if that's like you need that to sell like 10,000 copies, which most academic books aren't, but it's come on, there's reasons to support people and
Yeah,
yeah.
perfect. I don't know, Elias, did you want to add anything to that, or are you happy with X
I'm happy. I
bus?
won't
No,
cause any more
happy.
controversy.
No,
And
no,
very
no, all
quickly,
good.
so what are your future research plans, both of you? I mean, presumably you've got your own sort of things going now, and you may have collaborations planned, but you probably have other things, up your sleeve. So tell us about your future plans, and then I'll let you go.
Ilias, you first.
Okay, yeah, I do. I'm working on a couple of things related to racial capitalism and finance. A special issue that I'm very excited about with Ali Bagat and Vincent Garmon. The three of us are editing a special issue for review of international political economy, which will be great, I think. So I'm excited about that. And I'm trying to get some money for a project on financing green industrial plans in the global south, looking at a range of cases, a range of sectors, from semiconductors to EV batteries and green energy and so on. So mostly those two things, and then a bunch of probably way too many other things, but I won't say too much about this right now.
Thanks.
So for me, I've got I mean, I think related to this book, I'm working with a previous postdoc as well, who was part of the project for a while, Milan Babic, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, on decarbonizing states as owners. So kind of taking all that state ownership that we see and looking at how states have that capacity through their ownership to decarbonize or at least contribute to a transition to, if it's not net zero, at least sort of a low carbon trajectory. But a lot of what I'm doing is trying to build Adam Smith's home back into a state of intellectual engagement through lectures and debates and the like. So I've at a sort of different stage in my career where it's less about, yes, I'm going to have contributions to the ref here in the UK, but it's more about doing more public engagement, more of that kind of work here at Panmure House. So I would suggest to people, please go to panmurehouse.org and sign up for our newsletter so you can see what we're doing. You can, Indrajit was on my podcast called The New Enlightenment. So was Ilias, right? We've got a YouTube page, 10 million viewers every single episode, minus about 999 million. But it's okay. We're working on it. Again, what we should be doing in academia is discussing ideas and debating them. And,
Yeah.
that's what I want to do.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your time. I apologize again for the technical glitches at the start, but I'm very glad we were able to have this conversation from which I learned a great deal, and I'm sure those who will listen in to us will also do. Thank you so much, everyone, for whenever you get a chance to listen in to this, and we'll have another set of conversations coming up on Monday, which will be with Robtel Paley, looking at questions of citizenship in the context of Liberia specifically, but also the broader African continent. So see you there then. Thank you both. I think we'll be